High above the Pacific in Santa Barbara, a house called Bellosguardo remained ready for a woman who did not come back. The gardens were tended, shutters were opened to the California light. Furniture, books, paintings, and musical instruments stayed in their rooms. Property managers and household workers kept watch over a 21,000 square foot mansion on 24 oceanfront acres, even though its owner had not visited for more than half a century. On Fifth Avenue in New York, the same owner held 3 apartments with 42 rooms between them. They occupied an entire floor and half of another. In Connecticut, she owned Le Beau Chateau, a country estate spread across roughly 52 acres. A caretaker lived nearby, but the owner never spent a night inside the main house. These places were not abandoned in the ordinary sense. Taxes were paid. Repairs were ordered. Staff remained on payroll. Insurance stayed in force. The rooms were protected from decay, even when plans for their owner's return had lost any practical meaning. An abandoned property loses its active owner. Bellosguardo, 907 Fifth Avenue, and Le Beau Chateau did not. Their link to Huguette ran through invoices, keys, telephone instructions, and wages instead of footsteps in a hall. Her absence changed how the houses functioned, but it did not end her control over them. That gap made the system durable and later made the upkeep records relevant to her estate. The woman paying for all of it was Huguette Clark, daughter of a copper magnate and former United States Senator. For almost the last 20 years of her life, she occupied a hospital room in Manhattan. She had entered in 1991 with a dangerous illness. Surgery worked. Doctors considered her healthy enough to leave. Clark chose to stay. If history told through the rooms people left behind belongs in your queue, subscribe to Dynasty and Dust. That choice is the center of her story, but it is not the whole answer. A hospital room could not maintain 3 estates by itself. Around it grew a small system of nurses, doctors, employees, lawyers, accountants, property managers, and friends. Some cared for Clark, some received gifts, some did both. After her death, the people who had sustained her life became the people a court was asked to judge. The conflict was already visible on paper. On March 7, 2005, Clark signed a will that left most of her fortune to distant relatives. On April 19th, only 6 weeks later, she signed another will that cut those relatives out. The second document favored an arts foundation, a nurse, a goddaughter, a hospital, several employees, and the professional advisors who helped manage her affairs. When Clark died in 2011 at 104, more than $300 million remained. Her relatives said the second will had been produced by incapacity and undue influence. Her executors said it expressed the wishes of a private, alert woman who knew exactly what she owned. The dispute reached jury selection, then ended in a settlement. No court ever decided which account was right. That leaves a harder historical problem than a simple mystery about a rich recluse. The mansions tell us that Clark's absence was active, expensive, and repeatedly renewed. The hospital records tell us that remaining there became a choice after medical need had passed. The gifts and wills show how control over access to one room could shape the movement of an enormous fortune. To understand why Huguette Clark kept 3 homes waiting while she lived behind one hospital door, we have to begin with the man who built the fortune and who believed money should never remain invisible. William Andrews Clark was born in Pennsylvania in 1839, long before anyone could imagine his youngest daughter living into the age of commercial jet travel. He moved west while the interior of the United States was being reorganized by railways, mining camps, banks, and land speculation. In Montana Territory, he learned that the most valuable position was not simply at the face of a mine. It was at the points where ore, credit, timber, transport, and political permission met. Clark traded and prospected, then moved into the businesses that supported extraction. Mines needed lumber. Workers and owners needed banks. Ore needed smelters and rail links. A man who controlled several links in that chain could earn money at more than one stage and could survive failures that ruined a narrower operator. Copper made the system far larger. The spread of electric power created vast demand for a metal that carried current well. Clark's holdings in and around Butte placed him inside one of the most important industrial transformations of the late 19th century. Copper wire ran through cities, factories, and homes. Profits from the rock under Montana ground moved into timber, banking, newspapers, railroads, urban land, and art. The fortune was not passive wealth. It was an operating network. Clark knew how to convert one asset into leverage over another. A bank could support a business acquisition. A newspaper could defend a political campaign. A railway could increase the value of land that seemed remote before the tracks arrived. His rail project between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles helped create the conditions for a small Nevada settlement to expand into Las Vegas. The name Clark County still records the link. Yet Clark did not resemble a builder who wanted his influence to disappear into infrastructure. He wanted office, credit, and visible proof that the Western fortune belonged among the established fortunes of the East. Railways reveal why the Clark fortune became more than a mine owner's wealth. A copper property could produce a valuable metal, but the ore still needed to reach a smelter and a market. A railway could lower transport costs for Clark's businesses while raising land values along its path. Stations attracted merchants and workers. Town lots that had seemed speculative could become valuable once trains stopped nearby. The line was therefore both a service and a machine for creating new assets. This ability to make one holding increase another gave Clark resilience and enemies. Competitors saw a man using capital to shape the conditions under which everyone else had to operate. Workers saw the dangerous labor beneath the profits. Politicians saw campaign money, newspaper influence, and jobs that could be offered or withheld. A fortune built through connected businesses did not remain separate from government for long. That desire mattered to Huguette because it shaped the physical world she inherited. Her father's money became rooms on a scale few families could fill, collections too large for private walls, and properties in several states. The houses were not incidental rewards. They were part of the family's public argument about rank. William Clark also carried an insecurity that the rooms could not settle. Men whose wealth came from mines and railways might be welcomed in New York, but they were still measured against older families. Political office promised another kind of legitimacy. A Senate seat would turn a businessman with Western enemies into a national lawmaker. Montana did not yet elect senators by direct public vote. Its legislature selected them. That made a campaign for the Senate, a campaign conducted through a small number of lawmakers, party officials, and intermediaries. It was exactly the sort of network Clark understood. He pursued the seat for years. In 1899, he finally arrived in Washington with credentials in hand. On the same day the Senate admitted him, opponents submitted a petition accusing him of buying the office. The fortune that had connected mines to markets was about to be reconstructed as a chain of envelopes, debts, mortgages, and votes. The Senate Committee on Privileges and Elections heard from 96 witnesses. Their testimony described offers and payments ranging from $240 to $100,000. Clark's agents were accused of paying mortgages, purchasing ranches, financing banks, settling personal debts, and handing cash to legislators. The committee also learned that Clark had destroyed checks connected with campaign transactions. This was not merely an allegation traded in a Montana newspaper. On April 23, 1900, the Senate committee unanimously concluded that William Clark was not entitled to the seat because his election had been secured through bribery. Before the full chamber acted, Clark resigned. His retreat was temporary. Montana's governor and lieutenant governor became part of a procedural struggle over filling the vacancy. That attempt failed. Clark then returned through a new legislative election in January 1901 and served one term in the Senate. The episode fixed his name to a memorable form of Gilded Age corruption. It also showed a feature of Clark's character that would echo through the family's history. He did not respond to a closed door by reducing the scale of his ambition. He found another route and built more. In Washington and New York, art offered a language of lasting power that electoral politics could not. Clark assembled European paintings, sculpture, tapestries, rare books, and decorative objects. He later left a major group of artworks to the Corcoran Gallery of Art. Cultural giving did not erase the Senate record, but it could place the Clark name on a gallery wall where the story was about connoisseurship instead of envelopes of money. Architecture offered an even more visible answer. At 5th Avenue and 77th Street in Manhattan, Clark commissioned a mansion that rose 6 stories and contained more than 100 rooms. It took years to complete. Stone, carving, metalwork, and imported interiors turned one city lot into a compressed European palace. The house said that a copper fortune could command the same materials, craftsmen, and art as an inherited name. It also revealed the strange burden of display. A building that large required a staff, an inventory, heat, repairs, security, and daily order whether or not the owner used every room. Wealth created space. Space created work. William's collection added another demand. Paintings and tapestries were not only purchases, they required walls, humidity control, cleaning, cataloging, and protection from fire and theft. Rare books needed shelves and stable conditions. A mansion built around a collection could never be treated as a shell. The objects made the rooms valuable, and the rooms had to protect the objects. Huguette inherited that operational logic even when she rejected its publicity. Her later instructions did not preserve bare real estate. They preserved furnished environments. That is why selling a house would have meant more than losing acreage. It would have separated objects from the rooms in which the family had placed them, and ended the working relationships that kept the whole system intact. Huguette would later reverse the emotional direction of that equation. Her father used money to make his presence unavoidable. She would use money to protect her absence. Yet the mechanism remained the same. In both lives, servants and property managers converted money into a controlled setting. Before that reversal, Huguette spent part of her childhood inside her father's architectural statement. To see what it offered and what it demanded, imagine entering a house that did not simply contain a family. It staged one. The Clark mansion faced Central Park from a stretch of Fifth Avenue that wealthy New Yorkers were transforming into a corridor of private palaces. Its scale made neighboring houses look restrained. Visitors passed through rooms designed around a collection, not domestic necessity. Galleries held paintings. A conservatory and music rooms supported performance. Elevators, service passages, kitchens, storage areas, and staff quarters kept the public rooms functioning. For a child, such a building could be both home and institution. Huguette did not choose its symbolism. She inherited it at the breakfast table. The family could move between private rooms, formal rooms, and spaces intended for guests who came to see the collection and, by extension, to see William Clark. The mansion also contained the logistics of hierarchy. Coal and food entered somewhere. Ash and laundry left somewhere else. Bells and corridors directed workers who were expected to be present when needed, and nearly invisible when not. The polished surface depended on repeated labor in parts of the building that society photographs rarely showed. This matters because Huguette's later empty houses were never truly empty. Their quiet depended on the same hidden work. A deserted house decays. A Clark house without its owner could remain immaculate only if someone dusted, inspected, trimmed, heated, repaired, and reported. The Fifth Avenue Palace was completed when Huguette was young. Her father was already an old man. William was 67 when she was born in Paris on June 9, 1906. The age gap placed her in a family that seemed to span two separate historical eras. Her much older half-siblings came from William's first marriage. Huguette and her older sister Andrée were the children of his second marriage to Anna LaChapelle. That second household attracted gossip because of the gap in age and the uncertainty surrounding the early years of William and Anna's relationship. By the time the family occupied the mansion, however, Anna was its mistress, and the two girls were its youngest generation. Huguette grew up with tutors, travel, music, art, and material freedom. She also grew up inside a divided family line. Her father's older children had lives and children of their own. Huguette belonged to a younger branch, centered on Anna and Andrée. This distance would matter more than 80 years later, when descendants of the older branch appeared in a New York courtroom. Most had never met Huguette. The April 2005 will would describe the contact as minimal. Yet if that document failed, estate law could direct much of the estate toward them. In childhood, none of that conflict was visible. The important circle was small and immediate. Huguette painted and played music. Andrée shared her rooms and holidays. Anna organized the family life around them. William continued to collect, build, and pursue enterprises far from Fifth Avenue. Then, the smaller branch lost one of its two daughters. Andrée Clark died of meningitis in 1919. She was 16. Huguette was 13. The evidence allows us to describe what the family did afterward more securely than it allows us to describe every emotion the death produced. Anna and Huguette drew closer. They spent long periods away from New York. The surviving daughter continued to make art. Years later, a public landscape in Santa Barbara received Andrée's name. It is tempting to turn the death into a key that unlocks every later choice Huguette made. That would be too simple. She lived for 92 more years. She married, divorced, exhibited paintings, collected art, maintained friendships, managed property, and made decisions that cannot be reduced to one childhood loss. Still, Andrée's absence became part of the family's geography. William Clark had purchased the Santa Barbara property that became Bellosguardo in 1923. The site stood above the Pacific, far from the social machinery of Fifth Avenue. It offered Anna and Huguette a place where family life could be arranged around gardens, views, music, and familiar staff. William died in New York on March 2, 1925. His fortune was estimated at more than $200 million, an extraordinary sum in its own time. He divided wealth among children and museums, and his art collection strengthened the Clark link to the Corcoran Gallery in Washington. Huguette was 18 when her father died. She inherited financial autonomy before she had formed a public adult life. Money removed many ordinary pressures. She did not need to earn a wage, accept an unwanted marriage, sell a house she was not using, or invite visitors she did not want to see. It allowed choice to harden into structure. It also placed a young woman inside an administrative world created by older men, banks, trustees, attorneys, property managers, and accountants helped move and protect the fortune. Huguette could decide how she wanted to live, but every large decision still passed through firms with records, procedures, and their own interests. Privacy from the public did not mean autonomy from financial machinery. That machinery would outlast nearly every personal relationship in her life. Trustees changed, firms merged, staff retired. New advisors inherited files created by predecessors. By the time Huguette signed her wills, some professional relationships had lasted for decades and carried knowledge few relatives possessed. The people who understood how the fortune worked were also people whose advice could influence what happened to it. The same freedom made her wishes difficult for outsiders to read. Most people reveal priorities through constraints. A job requires attendance. A mortgage forces a sale. A house too large for one person must be divided or abandoned. Huguette could avoid those tests. She could preserve several incompatible options at once. She could keep an apartment in New York and a retreat in California. Later, she could add a Connecticut estate without moving into it. She could pay workers to maintain rooms she might never enter again. The cost did not force a decision. This did not make Clark irrational. It made her unusually protected from consequences that clarify other lives. A person with ordinary means eventually has to decide which place is home. Huguette could keep paying for all of them while living somewhere else. Her first major public memorial after William's death joined money, loss, and landscape. It was not a mansion. It was water and habitat beside the Santa Barbara estate. The land below Bellosguardo included an old coastal salt marsh that had been altered by roads, rail building, and changing water flow. In 1928, Huguette gave $50,000 to improve it as a refuge for migratory birds. The lake was named the Andrée Clark Bird Refuge. The refuge remains a 42-acre city park. Its history records Huguette doing something more public than the legend of a woman hiding behind shutters. She used money, while still in her early 20s, to create a living memorial outside the gates of the family estate. The gift also carried a pattern that would return in her final will. Private property and family memory could be redirected toward art, habitat, or public use. The Clark name could remain attached, but the object would serve people who had never known the family. In 1928, Huguette also married William MacDonald Gower, a Princeton graduate who had worked in her father's circle. The wedding took place at Bellosguardo. The marriage lasted 2 years. After the divorce, she continued to use the name Mrs. Huguette Clark. Public life had not yet closed around her. In 1929, the Corcoran Gallery displayed 7 of her paintings. She was not merely someone who purchased art. She worked at it, studied it, and allowed her work to be shown in the museum that held her father's collection. Those 2 years contain a version of Huguette, often lost behind the later hospital door. She was a young heiress who married, exhibited art, traveled, and appeared in society reporting. She had the means to build a recognizable public career. She chose a quieter direction. By the late 1930s, her name largely disappeared from society pages. She lived with Anna at 907 Fifth Avenue, painted, played music, collected objects, and communicated with a limited circle. Privacy was not yet confinement to a single room. It was a household arrangement supported by wealth. Meanwhile, her father's great mansion at 962 Fifth Avenue did not survive him for long. Its size and highly personal design made it difficult to adapt. The building was emptied and demolished. The site eventually became an apartment building. The destruction offered a lesson about Gilded Age lasting power. A house can look like a monument and still vanish within a generation. Holdings scatter. Stone is cut away. Rooms survive only in plans and photographs. Anna and Huguette responded differently at Bellosguardo. They demolished an older villa on the site, but not to leave the land. They commissioned a new house. During the Depression, the project employed workers while creating a home designed around their own habits rather than William's hunger for display. The family story was moving from the largest rooms in New York toward a house above the Pacific. Yet the principle that kept the rooms alive remained labor. At Bellosguardo, even retreat would have a payroll. When workers began dismantling William Clark's Fifth Avenue mansion, they were taking apart more than a home. The building had been engineered as a claim to lasting power. Its imported stone and paneled interiors were supposed to place a Western mining fortune among the established dynasties of New York. Yet the house depended on one man's appetite for scale. Once he was gone, its rooms were liabilities attached to valuable land. The demolition did not impoverish the family. Huguette and Anna moved within a different kind of luxury, one that was easier to control. At 907 Fifth Avenue, they occupied apartments rather than a freestanding palace. They still had servants, art, music, and views toward Central Park, but an apartment building placed an outer layer of staff and security between the street and their private rooms. That boundary matters. William's mansion pushed the family name outward. The apartment allowed Anna and Huguette to decide who came through a staffed lobby, who reached the elevator, and who crossed their threshold. It provided many of the comforts of the palace with fewer public obligations. Huguette's estate also held investments and cash that did not need to be displayed. She could support artists, buy rare objects, and employ people without turning those acts into society news. Her life became less visible. At the same time, her financial power remained immense. The historical record grows thinner as she withdrew. That is not an accident or a gap we should fill with fantasy. Privacy changes the surviving evidence. Public figures leave speeches, interviews, campaign files, and photographs. Huguette left checks, property instructions, paintings, letters to a limited circle, staff recollections, medical records, and eventually 2 wills. Those records show activity. They do not show a woman doing nothing. She followed art sales, arranged purchases, commissioned work, managed household needs, and maintained long telephone relationships. She took an intense interest in dolls and miniature buildings, objects that allowed scale, dress, furnishing, and social scenes to be controlled by hand. Miniatures can be sentimental without being meaningless. In a dollhouse, rooms remain where the owner places them. Nothing is demolished because land has become more valuable. A figure does not arrive without permission. Furniture can preserve a period after the real world has changed. We do not need to claim that Huguette consciously modeled her life on those objects. The more secure link is practical. She devoted focus and money to artful environments that could be kept stable. Her real houses were governed by a similar demand. They were to be preserved through staff effort even when she was not present. The Clark mansion had shown that money could build more space than a family needed. Its destruction showed that unused scale survives only while someone keeps paying. Huguette would spend the next decades proving she was willing to pay. Before the houses became her most visible legacy, however, she tried to make something with her own name on it. The 7 paintings shown at the Corcoran in 1929 complicate the later image of Huguette as a passive heir surrounded by things other people made. She painted landscapes, portraits, and scenes that reflected formal study. Music mattered as well. She played the harp and owned fine instruments, including a Stradivarius violin. The arts connected several generations of the family without making them identical. William collected on the scale of a tycoon and gave a major group of artworks to a museum. Huguette made pictures, supported artists, bought objects, and later tried to direct a large part of her estate toward an arts foundation. Anna shaped a house whose rooms and gardens functioned as a setting for that shared interest. Public exhibition offered Huguette a route to recognition that did not depend entirely on inheritance. Yet even a favorable gallery appearance could not separate her work from the Clark name. The Corcoran already held her father's collection. Newspapers knew her as the daughter of a copper king. Wealth created the opportunity and obscured the measure of what she had made. After the show, she did not build a public career. Her paintings remained inside family spaces. Decades later, more than 50 works attributed to her were still among her possessions. When 17 were sold at auction after her death, the group brought $142,625. The figure does not settle artistic quality. It does confirm sustained production rather than a single youthful display. Her collecting moved between museum art and objects that many adults treated as toys. Antique dolls, elaborate clothing, and miniature houses filled rooms and storage. She supported craftsmen who repaired or created them. The work required exact dimensions, fabric choices, carved details, and patient correspondence. The collection also maintained relationships beyond New York. Makers and dealers could send photographs, samples, and finished work. Huguette could commission an object without attending a show or walking through a shop. A miniature room allowed collaboration at a distance, with choices expressed through color, scale, furniture, and dress. This pattern resembles the way she handled real property, but the comparison should remain practical. Both systems let her direct material results through intermediaries. A craftsperson might receive detailed instructions for a doll costume. A manager might receive instructions for a repair at Bellosguardo. Huguette's physical absence did not eliminate decision-making. It changed the channel through which decisions traveled. This is one place where later accounts often slip from description into diagnosis. An old woman liked dolls. Therefore, the argument runs, she must have been detached from reality. The relatives challenging her will would point to the collection as part of a pattern they considered evidence of incapacity. Her defenders treated it as the lifelong interest of an artist and collector. The objects cannot answer the legal question. Adults of sound mind collect unusual things. People with cognitive impairment may also collect them. A doll tells us what Huguette bought, commissioned, and preserved. It does not tell us whether she understood the split of a $300 million estate on a specific day in 2005. What the collection does reveal is a preference for controlled detail. Huguette could spend hours on the material problem of a costume or miniature room while refusing the unpredictable demands of a public appearance. That preference fit the life she built with Anna at 907 Fifth Avenue. Their household was private, but it was not isolated in the later hospital sense. Employees came and went. Business was conducted. Friends and artists remained in contact. The apartment operated as a protected domestic world in the center of Manhattan. Huguette had stepped away from one public path after her marriage ended. The retreat was gradual enough that few people recognized where it would lead. William MacDonald Gower was the son of one of William Clark's business associates. On paper, the match joined people who understood the expectations surrounding the fortune. The couple married at Bellosguardo in August 1928. Huguette was 22. The union ended in divorce in 1930. Contemporary coverage treated the distance as society news, because nearly anything involving a Clark fortune could become society news. Huguette did not remarry. She continued to use the title Mrs., but she did not build the public household expected of a wealthy divorced woman with prominent links. The temptation is to invent a single dramatic reason. Surviving evidence does not justify one. The marriage was brief. Afterward, Huguette organized her life around Anna, art, property, and a small set of relationships. That is enough to explain the change without supplying a secret confession no document records. Her withdrawal also had a material setting. At 907 Fifth Avenue, mother and daughter could live together without sharing their day with the public. The building stood at 72nd Street, facing Central Park. Huguette eventually held 3 units that together covered about 15,000 square feet. The total of 42 rooms included formal rooms, bedrooms, service spaces, and areas used for art and storage. That was not modest living. It was privacy at palatial scale. The apartment did not require Huguette to choose between seclusion and abundance. She could have both. The household also made Anna the stable center of Huguette's adult life. They spent seasons in Santa Barbara and returned to New York. They shared collecting and artistic interests. Staff members learned their habits over years. A worker who understood when to open a room, how to handle a textile, or which visitor was expected became part of the machinery that protected continuity. Long service can make a household efficient, but it can also make change feel dangerous. A new employee has to learn the objects, the schedule, the security rules, and the owner's boundaries. For someone already reluctant to meet strangers, replacing one trusted worker may feel larger than the task suggests. Money makes it possible to retain people. Retention makes the household more dependent on the people who remain. The same loop later appeared in the hospital. Huguette preferred familiar caregivers because they reduced unwanted contact. Familiarity made them more important. Their importance made gifts and bequests seem natural to her and suspicious to challengers. The seed of that conflict was present in the household long before any nurse entered the story. This continuity lasted through enormous changes outside. The Depression destroyed jobs and fortunes. The Second World War reordered travel and industry. New buildings replaced private palaces along Fifth Avenue. Television entered American homes. Huguette and Anna could update what they chose, while keeping other rooms and routines close to an earlier period. Money did not stop time, but it could reduce the number of changes that entered without permission. That became one of the practical functions of the Clark fortune. It also created need on trusted workers. The more a household valued sameness, the more important the person became who knew where things belonged. Property managers, caretakers, maids, drivers, and accountants held operational knowledge that an outsider lacked. Replacing them could be disruptive. Keeping them could make their roles last for decades. At Bellosguardo, Anna transformed that principle into architecture. The house was rebuilt during the worst economic crisis of the century. Its building served a family seeking retreat and workers seeking wages. Once complete, it became the most carefully preserved of Huguette's homes, and the one that would carry her final public wishes. William Clark had bought the Santa Barbara property in 1923. An Italianate villa already occupied the bluff. After his death, Anna decided to replace it. She hired architect Reginald Johnson, whose work included prominent California hotels and estates. The new Bellosguardo was completed in 1933. The timing placed a private luxury project inside mass unemployment. According to the estate's history, demolishing the older house and constructing the new one provided jobs during the Depression. Stone, plaster, wiring, carpentry, landscaping, and interior finishing turned family money into wages, while creating a home few families could ever afford. The finished house spread across several wings, rather than rising like William's vertical palace. Its ocean setting shaped the rooms. Windows and terraces faced the water. Gardens and paths organized the approach. The design allowed formal art display, music, service work, and private family life without the urban pressure of Fifth Avenue. Huguette and Anna used Bellosguardo in the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s. People who knew the estate remembered them as real occupants, not spectral figures from a later legend. The house hosted family habits, employees, meals, and visits. Huguette painted there. The ocean view was part of her lived geography. Then the visits stopped. The exact last season is less important than the durable order that followed. Anna and Huguette remained in New York, but Bellosguardo was not emptied or sold. Furniture stayed, art stayed, cars remained in the garage. Workers maintained the grounds and protected the buildings. The estate accumulated stories because long absence invites invention. One legend claimed that a dining table was always set for the women's return. People familiar with the property have rejected that detail. The documented reality is strange enough. An owner who did not visit continued to finance a functioning property system for decades. The cars in the garage became a better symbol because they combined value, machinery, and inactivity. A parked automobile still deteriorates. Tires, fluids, batteries, upholstery, and metal respond to time even when the odometer does not move. Keeping old cars inside a maintained estate required decisions about whether to service, conserve, or leave them as they were. The gardens were even less forgiving. Plants cannot be wrapped and placed in storage. Coastal wind, salt, drought, insects, and growth make upkeep continuous. A clipped hedge records recent work. A clear path records recent work. Bellosguardo looked still because labor kept correcting the changes that nature produced. What did that system preserve? It preserved assets, certainly. Oceanfront Santa Barbara land was valuable. It preserved art and furniture. It also preserved a possible return. As long as the house remained ready, Huguette did not have to decide that a chapter of life was over. The boundary between wishes and option matters. There is no good evidence that she packed a bag each year and planned a specific journey. There is strong evidence that she insisted on upkeep. The house stayed available whether or not she acted on the option. That was a form of control. Selling would have transferred the future to someone else. Closing rooms or dismissing staff would have allowed visible decline. Continued upkeep let Huguette keep the property in a state she recognized while remaining 3,000 miles away. The labor also connected her to people outside the apartment. A property manager could report a repair. A caretaker could monitor weather damage. Gardeners responded to living plants that could not be placed in storage. Bellosguardo's calm surface was a chain of decisions. In New York, the chain was shorter and more immediate. 42 rooms surrounded Huguette and Anna, filled with art, sound, fabric, and objects. There, privacy was not a distant instruction. It was the pattern of every day. At 907 Fifth Avenue, the numbers are easy to mistake for overstatement. Huguette's apartments included the whole 8th floor and half of the 12th, a total of 42 rooms over about 15,000 square feet. The units did not form one simple rectangle. They created layers of living, service, collection, and storage across 2 levels of the building. Anna and Huguette lived among paintings by artists whose names belonged in museums. Musical instruments and rare books shared space with personal artwork and dolls. Some rooms supported normal domestic life. Others existed because the family owned more objects than a conventional home could hold. The apartment building provided an important boundary. A doorman could intercept a stranger before Huguette had to refuse them herself. An elevator reduced exposure to the street. Deliveries, repairs, and messages could pass through employees. The structure converted money into distance from unwanted contact. The vertical distance inside the building gave Huguette another form of control. The 8th floor rooms and the 12th floor rooms could hold different functions and different levels of access. A visitor admitted to one area did not automatically move through the entire collection. Staff could receive deliveries without turning every room into a public path. Yet size worked against full oversight. No one person could watch 42 rooms from a chair. Dust, leaks, temperature, and building work had to be reported. Huguette's ability to remain private therefore rested on accepting details from employees. The more successfully the apartment shielded her from strangers, the more she depended on the accuracy of the few people it admitted. Yet the home still required vulnerability. A maid entered private rooms. A building worker knew whether a resident had gone out. An accountant saw bills. A property employee might understand more about Huguette's daily life than a distant relative did. Privacy did not mean the absence of other people. It meant selecting a narrow group and giving that group unusual access. This is the arrangement that later probate arguments would examine. Relatives had family status without daily contact. Employees and caregivers had daily contact without family status. The second will favored people, museums, and charities inside Huguette's chosen circle. The first will allowed legal kinship to control most of the estate. Each document answered a different question about who was close. While Anna lived, that conflict remained theoretical. She was Huguette's closest family member and household partner. Her presence gave the apartment a stable power that no nurse, lawyer, or distant heir could replace. Anna died in 1963. Huguette was 57. She now held the properties, collections, and investments without the person around whom her adult home had been organized. Accounts of her life often identified this death as the moment she became more secluded. The chronology supports a change in visibility, but the evidence does not support a neat medical cause. What can be said is concrete. Huguette remained at 907 Fifth. She continued to pay staff. She continued to maintain Bellosguardo. Her direct encounters narrowed, and telephone contact became more important. The apartment grew less like a base for movement between properties and more like a protected world of its own. Outside, neighborhoods changed and people aged. Inside, the collection and rooms stayed almost unchanged. Clark could have simplified. She had the money to move into a smaller staffed home or to renovate one house around her needs. Instead, she kept the large New York footprint and the California estate. She also kept a third property in Connecticut that neither she nor Anna had ever made into a home. Le Beau Chateau shows most clearly that Huguette's real estate was not governed by ordinary use. She bought the option, maintained the option, and declined to exercise it for more than half a century. Le Beau Chateau stood in New Canaan, Connecticut, behind gates and trees on roughly 52 acres. The French-style home had been built in 1937 for former Senator David A. Reed. Huguette bought it in the early 1950s. She never moved in. By the strongest accounts, she never spent a single night there. The property still had a caretaker and received upkeep. Its grounds were not left to close over the drive. The house remained an asset and a possible refuge within reach of Manhattan, yet it did not become part of Huguette's lived routine. New Canaan was known for large country properties within reach of New York. For a wealthy family, such a house could separate weekdays from weekends and city obligations from private rest. Huguette's purchase fit that social geography even though her use did not. She acquired the expected escape and then refused the journey. The mismatch is more informative than a theory. Ownership served a purpose even without occupancy. It prevented another buyer from controlling the land. It created an address available in an emergency. It held financial value. It allowed Huguette to say, in effect, that the option remained hers. Any one of those functions could justify continued ownership to her without producing a night in the house. Why buy it? Several practical options fit the evidence. A country house could offer security outside the city. It could serve as an alternative if the Fifth Avenue apartment became unsuitable. It was private, guarded by acreage, and far easier to control than a hotel. But no surviving statement establishes one final motive. That uncertainty is useful because it prevents a false answer. Huguette's wealth allowed an option to remain unresolved. Most people test a house by moving in, selling it, or losing money they cannot afford. She could postpone the test indefinitely. The property became a pure example of upkeep without occupancy. Someone checked the roof, controlled moisture, managed utilities, protected the grounds, and watched for damage. A house that survived decades of vacancy in a usable state did so because workers kept intervening. This is where the word empty becomes misleading. No owner slept in the bedrooms, but labor, invoices, keys, and inspections moved through the place. The house remained part of an economic network. Huguette's absence produced work. The same was true in Santa Barbara and New York. By the 1980s, the three homes formed a distributed household with one owner at its center. Property managers knew their own buildings. Staff handled objects and rooms. Professional advisors moved money. Huguette issued instructions through calls and intermediaries. Age increased the cost of this system. Buildings require capital repairs. Art requires care. Employees need pay and replacements. Taxes continue whether a bedroom is occupied or not. The money still existed, but some of it was illiquid. Paintings and real estate could be immensely valuable without producing the cash needed for gifts and ongoing expenses. Maintaining several worlds also made personal access more consequential. If Huguette would not meet a new property worker, someone trusted had to introduce or manage that person. If she would not visit a site, she depended on reports. Each decision made the circle around her more important. None of this required a hospital. Before 1991, 907 Fifth remained the place where Huguette actually lived. She had maids, food, familiar rooms, and access to medical care if she chose to seek it. The medical care was the weak point. She had avoided doctors long enough for treatable lesions on her face to become dangerous. On March 26, 1991, the woman who owned 42 rooms in Manhattan entered a hospital so malnourished and dehydrated that the immediate question was not which house she preferred. It was whether she would survive. Before following Huguette through the hospital door, it helps to see the organization she left behind. 3 homes in 3 states did not report to one conventional household office. They were held together by money, long relationships, and repeated instructions. At Bellosguardo, a manager oversaw the California property. Gardeners and other workers responded to the daily needs of land and buildings. At Le Beau Chateau, a caretaker watched an estate whose owner never arrived. At 907 Fifth Avenue, a maintainer and building staff protected apartments filled with valuable property. The April 2005 will confirms these roles because Huguette named several of them for bequests. The California manager was to receive an amount equal to 2 years of gross salary. The New Canaan caretaker was to receive 1 year's salary. The maintainer of the Fifth Avenue apartments was to receive $25,000. Huguette described these gifts as credit for years of loyal service. Those provisions do not prove that every worker was treated generously or that every property decision was wise. They do show that Huguette understood the homes as places maintained by particular people over time. The staff were not interchangeable shadows. They were named participants in the system. Property upkeep is repetitive by design. A roof inspected before rain produces no dramatic scene if it works. A pipe repaired before it bursts leaves no ruined room for a camera. Insurance premiums and property taxes produce paper rather than spectacle. The success of the system appears as nothing happening. Instructions had to survive distance as well as repetition. A manager deciding whether to replace a worn material needed to know whether Huguette preferred exact restoration or practical substitution. An employee discovering damage had to decide how many details to send and through whom. Delays could raise costs. Overstepping could end a trusted relationship. The owner controlled the money, but the worker controlled the first account of a problem. This small fact explains why property staff appeared in the will. They were custodians of details as well as buildings. Huguette's preserved world depended on their judgment about what she needed to know. That quiet success can hide cost. One report of estate finances later put Bellosguardo's operating expenses at about $8 million between 1997 and 2011. Exact categories and time periods differ across accounts, but the order of magnitude is clear. Preserving a coastal estate for an absent owner consumed millions. The homes also stored value. Oceanfront land, Fifth Avenue apartments, art, jewels, and rare objects could be sold. Huguette did sell assets in later years when cash needs increased. Yet selling changed the protected world. Each object that left turned lasting power into a transaction. As long as she lived at 907 Fifth, the distributed household had a center that was still one of the properties. Staff could bring the outside world to her door. Art surrounded her. Even if she seldom entered many rooms, she remained within the collection and the routines built with Anna. The hospital broke that physical link. After March 1991, she never returned to the Fifth Avenue apartments. She never saw Bellosguardo again. She never entered Le Beau Chateau. The properties continued, but their owner now experienced them through reports, memories, invoices, and requests. This made the people around her hospital room more powerful in a plain operational sense. They did not automatically control her. They controlled routes of access. A caller needed to get through. A document needed to reach her. A bill needed approval. A nurse could spend 12 hours in the room, while a relative spent none. Access is not the same as influence, and influence is not automatically undue. The boundary would become the central issue after Clark's death. During her life, it was simply how the system worked. The medical crisis intensified it overnight. Huguette arrived at Doctors Hospital on March 26, 1991. She was nearly 85 and weighed about 75 pounds. Basal cell cancers had been left untreated on her face. The lesions interfered with eating and affected her lip, cheek, and eyelid. She was dehydrated and dangerously weak. These facts sit uneasily beside the properties. A woman spending millions to prevent deterioration in distant houses had allowed her own treatable illness to advance until she was near death. The contradiction does not require a theory about madness. It shows that control worked differently across domains. Huguette could authorize a roof repair by telephone while refusing a physician access to her body. Hospital notes described the difficulty of the first days. She concealed herself under sheets and resisted review. Staff had to establish enough trust to treat her. The patient who had organized her life around selective access now faced a medical team that needed to see what she had hidden. Surgeons removed the cancers and reconstructed damaged parts of her face. Nutrition and daily care restored strength. The care succeeded. Huguette did not remain a terminal patient, kept in an acute care bed, because she could not survive elsewhere. Doctors Hospital was a private Manhattan hospital accustomed to wealthy patients. Its setting did not resemble a public ward. Huguette had a room with a view, private nursing, meals, and a staff able to handle requests. When the hospital later merged into Beth Israel Medical Center, she moved within the hospital system rather than returning home. The length of that stay is one of the few details that captures the scale without overstatement. Huguette spent 7,364 nights in hospitals. A temporary room became the only occupied home in a portfolio that included ocean acreage, 42 Manhattan rooms, and a Connecticut estate. Why did she remain? The record supports several practical advantages. The hospital controlled the door. Care was available without inviting a succession of new people into 907 Fifth. Meals arrived. Guards and nurses were always nearby. A private nurse could provide continuity. The room demanded fewer household decisions than 42 rooms filled with fragile property. What the record does not provide is one final answer from Huguette that accounts for every year. Some observers described fear of returning to the apartment. Others emphasized that she was content and liked the care. The hospital had financial reasons to retain a rich resident. Huguette had personal reasons to prefer a controlled setting. More than one thing can be true. Her decision also changed over time. Staying for another week after surgery was not identical to staying for another year at 95. Each period renewed the arrangement. Habit, age, trust, hearing loss, physical weakness, and the effort of reopening a household could make departure harder without proving that anyone imprisoned her. The legal record reviewed for this episode does not support saying Clark was held against her will. It supports saying that after recovery, she elected to remain, even when a physician urged her to go home. That makes the next question more interesting. What did she gain by choosing the smallest room she owned no part of? Huguette recovered well enough that the medical reason for an extended hospital stay fell away. Her physician later said he strongly encouraged her to return home. She declined. Accounts from people who saw or spoke with her described a woman who could be alert, cheerful, and engaged with subjects she cared about. The word choice matters. A hospital can be restrictive, but it can also remove demands. Huguette did not have to supervise a large apartment in person. She did not have to cross a lobby or ride through the city to reach care. The room placed predictable services on the other side of one controlled door. Her 3 houses represented ownership. The hospital represented availability. Nurses appeared at scheduled times. Food arrived without opening a private kitchen to a new household staff. Hospital staff could handle a broken television. If Huguette wanted solitude, the blinds and door could narrow the world quickly. This arrangement cost heavily. Estimates of her hospital expenses ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars a year before private gifts. Yet the cost remained small beside her wealth and the value of the homes. Money made a form of long-term home possible that the hospital system would not offer an ordinary patient. The hospital also reduced the physical range of her life. Huguette took short walks inside the room. She watched cartoons, followed news, painted, talked on the telephone, and worked with dolls or miniature projects. The outside world arrived through screens, calls, deliveries, and a few trusted people. Routine can become a reason of its own. After months in one place, The staff know how a patient likes meals and when she sleeps. After years, the room contains an accumulated order. Returning home would not restore the apartment as it existed in 1991. It would require selecting caregivers, arranging food, adapting bathrooms, coordinating security, and accepting that aging had changed what living alone meant. For someone who resisted new people, the move could be more threatening than the apartment was attractive. This is a reasoned reading of the facts, not something Huguette said. It explains why a choice can begin freely and become harder to reverse without meaning she was a prisoner. Some of those interests have been used to make her sound childlike. That is an interpretive choice, not a medical finding. A choice for cartoons or dolls does not establish incapacity. The stronger evidence about capacity concerns whether she understood her assets, her relatives, the people receiving benefits, and the effect of a will when she signed it. There was evidence on both sides. People who spoke with Huguette over many years found her memory, humor, and opinions intact. She could discuss investments and family history. Other records showed extreme seclusion, large gifts, need on caregivers, and periods in which advisors conducted business without seeing her face to face. The hospital magnified this ambiguity. A visitor could encounter a lively correspondent on one day and still know almost nothing about decisions made through someone else on another. A person may be competent and still vulnerable. A person may be dependent and still capable of choosing whom to trust. Later legal arguments would try to convert these shades into yes or no answers. Was the will hers? Did another person overpower her intent? The trial process was designed to force a decision, but the case settled before a jury could make one. During the hospital years, Huguette did not behave as if the houses had ceased to exist. Bills were paid, rooms were kept. She gave instructions and continued to own the property. Yet she did not inspect the results. Her link to home had become almost entirely mediated. That is the practical bridge between the empty mansions and the estate fight. The person who brought a document to the room, explained a cost, or carried a message stood between wishes and action. One person stood in that position more often than anyone else. Hadassah Peri entered Huguette's life through a private nursing job around 1991. She was not a relative, a society friend, or a member of the old household. She was a professional caregiver assigned when Clark needed sustained focus after surgery. The job became a bond lasting nearly 20 years. Peri spent long daily shifts with Huguette and called her Madame. She helped with personal care, company, meals, and the repetitive needs that make one caregiver more valuable over time, because the patient does not need to explain everything again. To say Peri became indispensable is not to decide why. A reliable routine has practical value. Huguette disliked strangers. A nurse who already knew her habits reduced the number of new people entering the room. The longer the bond lasted, the more disruptive a new nurse would become. The room created intimacy in an unusual setting. Huguette had no spouse, child, or surviving sibling. Most distant relatives did not visit and had little or no bond with her. Friends existed, including people who spoke with her by telephone, but they did not provide daily physical care. Peri did. That care took place across an enormous gap in wealth. Huguette could change Peri's life with a check. Peri could affect Huguette's comfort, details, and contact with other people. The bond joined care, labor, need, and money from the beginning. No single label captures it. Calling Peri only a devoted friend ignores that she was paid to nurse and later received millions in gifts. Calling her only a fortune hunter ignores the duration and physical labor of care. The probate fight turned these partial accounts into opposing cases. Huguette's giving expanded well beyond a normal holiday gift. She paid for homes, education, vehicles, family needs, and cash transfers. Contemporary totals vary, but about $30 million in lifetime gifts to Peri and her family is a defensible figure. To Huguette, those transfers may have expressed gratitude and the pleasure of solving problems for someone close to her. Peri said the bond mattered beyond the money. To challengers, the scale showed how a dependent older woman could be influenced by the person with the most access. Both interpretations arose from the same checks. The hospital had its own interest. Huguette paid substantial charges and made gifts connected with care. A later lawsuit accused hospital figures of soliciting benefits and failing to discharge a patient who no longer needed acute care. Doctors and the hospital disputed wrongdoing and described the arrangement as one that respected her wishes. Again, the record records conflict rather than a verdict. The fact of a financial interest does not by itself prove coercion. It does explain why neutral medical care became entangled with estate administration. Meanwhile, the hospital room remained personally sparse beside Huguette's properties. She did not transfer the Bellosguardo galleries into it. Instead, objects, drawings, dolls, and communications entered in manageable amounts. The room was small enough to oversee from a bed or chair. For a woman who had inherited houses built around hundreds of objects and dozens of workers, this was a different scale of power. She could refuse entry. She could call for help. Her world was smaller, but its perimeter was clear. The person inside that perimeter every day became the largest individual beneficiary named in Huguette's final will. In the April 2005 will, Huguette described Peri as her loyal nurse, friend, and companion. She left her the entire doll collection and 60% of the residuary estate, the balance remaining after debts, taxes, expenses, and specific gifts was to be divided with 25% going to goddaughter Wanda Stika and 15% to the new Bellosguardo Foundation. The size of Peri's share was striking even after the lifetime gifts. It made the bond central to any challenge. Yet a large bequest to a caregiver is not automatically invalid. The legal question is whether it expresses the testator's own wishes or results from influence strong enough to overcome those wishes. Care itself creates details no distant heir can match. A nurse knows pain, appetite, fear, irritation, humor, and the daily consequences of age. That knowledge can support good care and genuine intimacy. It can also give a caregiver leverage because the patient knows how difficult substitute would be. The law cannot presume that closeness is corrupt, but it cannot ignore the power created by need. Money complicates gratitude further. If Huguette believed a nurse had protected her life and dignity, a gift worth millions might have felt proportionate to a fortune worth hundreds of millions. To an outside observer, the same gift could exceed any plausible payment for service. Scale depends on which scale is used. The boundary is difficult because ordinary influence is everywhere. Friends persuade. Caregivers become trusted. A person who spends years helping someone may naturally become more important than a cousin who never calls. The law does not require an old person to divide wealth according to a family tree. Undue influence asks for something more. It looks for control, coercion, or manipulation that substitutes another person's purpose for the will maker's. Evidence often comes indirectly through access, need, secrecy, changes in estate plans, and benefits received. Huguette's circumstances offered material for both sides. She was physically dependent in some ways and highly isolated. Peri had extensive access and had already received extraordinary gifts. At the same time, Huguette had a long record of choosing a small circle, excluding distant family from daily life, and giving money according to personal attachments. Peri did not draft the will. Attorney Wallace Bach did. Accountant Irving Kamsler was involved in Huguette's finances. Both men received $500,000 bequests in the April document and were named as executors. Their dual roles would draw scrutiny because professionals who help make an estate plan are expected to manage conflicts carefully. The will also made gifts that fit Huguette's life long before the hospital. Bellosguardo was to support the arts. A Monet was directed to the Corcoran, where she had exhibited in 1929 and where her father's collection had been given. Staff who maintained her properties were recognized. These provisions were not random products of the last months of life. The distribution to Peri and other insiders was harder to separate from the circumstances of the room. Huguette's contact with her attorney could occur through a closed door or by telephone. The people carrying information might also benefit. The speed of the change between the two wills gave challengers a clear timeline to investigate. None of this proves that Huguette failed to understand. It proves that the process deserved review. The eventual lawsuit would include 54 depositions in 3 countries, a measure of how many relationships and transactions had to be reconstructed. Long before the lawyers arrived, gifts had already altered the balance. Each transfer gave contemporaries another data point, and later litigants another exhibit. Houses bought for a nurse, tuition paid for children, art given to museums, cash given to staff, and payments to physicians could be described either as giving or as evidence of abuse. The checks had one amount each. Their meanings multiplied after death. Huguette gave because she could, and because money was one of the clearest ways she interacted with people beyond the room. A request could arrive by talk or letter. She could answer with a payment that solved a medical bill, a school expense, a housing problem, or a professional need. Giving also let her exercise agency without leaving the hospital. She did not need to attend a ceremony or visit a new house. An advisor could transfer funds. A recipient could call with thanks. The act moved outward while Huguette remained behind the door. The scale made ordinary social boundaries hard to maintain. A gift that felt enormous to a nurse or technician could be small relative to Huguette's fortune. Yet repeated gifts reduced liquid assets and created expectations. When a recipient knew that one request had succeeded, another request became imaginable. Court-appointed investigators later examined tens of millions of dollars in transfers to medical figures. Public reporting described gifts to doctors, nurses, staff, friends, and charities. Some recipients said the gifts were unsolicited expressions of gratitude. Critics argued that medical professionals should have refused them because of the patient's need. The ethical question is not identical to the capacity question. A donor may understand a gift perfectly while the recipient still violates a professional boundary by accepting it. A hospital may benefit financially from a resident who chooses to stay without that choice being coerced. Separating those issues is essential. Huguette's fortune was vast, but not infinitely liquid. Properties and paintings had high appraised values. Payroll, hospital charges, taxes, upkeep, and gifts required cash. Advisors sold assets and managed accounts to keep money moving. Liquidity tied personal giving to the fate of the collection. A painting hanging in a closed room might be worth millions but could not pay a nurse, a tax bill, or a gardener until it was sold or borrowed against. Each transfer, therefore, raised a secondary question about which asset would be converted next. This is another reason the advisors mattered. They knew account balances, tax exposure, market values, and the cost of maintaining property. Huguette could authorize a gift, but professionals determined how to execute it. Their role was neither purely clerical nor unlimited. They translated desire into transactions and were expected to protect a client whose giving could conflict with long-term estate planning. This turned the preserved homes into financial evidence. Bellosguardo's bills showed that Huguette continued to support the estate. The Fifth Avenue expenses showed she had not formally relinquished her home. Connecticut caretaker payments showed the unused house still had a place in her plans, even if that place was only to remain available. The same expenditures could be criticized as waste. Why spend millions on buildings no one occupied? The answer is not that Huguette failed to know they existed. The will named property workers and described the assets in detail. She knew the houses and deliberately continued the arrangement. Knowing what one owns does not resolve susceptibility to influence. It does, however, challenge the easiest caricature of a woman unaware that fortunes were draining away. Huguette made choices other people found difficult to justify. Unusual choices are not automatically incompetent choices. By 2005, she was 98. She had no child or sibling. A will was no longer an abstract planning exercise. Without one, complex rules of estate would direct her estate to descendants of her father's older children. Those relatives were legally connected and personally distant. Huguette had resisted making a will for years. Advisors and others encouraged her to do it. When she finally signed one on March 7th, the result followed the family tree for most of the estate and gave Peri $5 million. 6 weeks later, the family tree disappeared from the plan. The March 7, 2005 will was short in concept. It left $5 million to Hadassah Peri. Most of what remained would pass as if Huguette had died without a more detailed split, which directed the estate toward descendants of her father's first family. That result did not mean Huguette had suddenly become close to those relatives. It meant estate law had a ready-made answer when a person left no spouse, child, parent, or sibling. Kinship could reach through William Clark's much older children to grandnieces, grandnephews, and later generations. Many of those people had never met Huguette. A few had encountered her decades earlier. Their link was genealogical, not domestic. Still, the family had a history of shared wealth. William had divided portions of his fortune among his children. From the relatives' perspective, the surviving Clark estate could be seen as the remainder of a common family source. The first will would later become the strongest evidence that Huguette had considered leaving them the money. It was not a hypothetical plan described by a witness. It was a signed instrument created only weeks before the document they challenged. Its fact also prevented a simple story in which greedy strangers appeared after death, with no basis beyond a surname. If the March will controlled, they stood to inherit. They had both financial motive to sue and a legal document supporting their alternative. Peri's $5 million gift was already substantial. It recognized the caregiver without allowing her to dominate the estate. Compared with the roughly $30 million in lifetime gifts, it was another large benefit, but not an unprecedented one. What changed between March 7th and April 19 is the core of the probate dispute. The calendar gives us 43 days. It does not give us a recording of every talk, draft, answer, and decision within them. The later will presented a coherent alternative principle. Instead of sending wealth along a family line Huguette barely used, it rewarded people in her chosen circle, museums linked to her art, and workers who cared for her property. That principle fit aspects of her life. It also benefited people with access to her and professionals participating in the plan. This is why the case could not be resolved by saying the second will looked strange. A will is allowed to be strange. It can prefer a nurse to a nephew. It can turn a private estate into a foundation. It can exclude people the law would otherwise favor. Testamentary freedom means little if it only protects conventional choices. The challenge had to focus on the process and Huguette's condition. Did she understand the nature and extent of her property? Did she know the people who would ordinarily inherit? Did she understand how the April document changed the March result? Was the decision hers, or had beneficiaries and advisors pushed beyond persuasion into control? Age alone could not answer. Huguette was 98, but a person does not lose the right to make a will on a birthday. Unusual habits could not answer either. The dolls, closed blinds, empty houses, and hospital residents might shape a jury's impression while proving very little about her understanding at the moment of signature. The clearest evidence would have come from people in or near the room, drafts and notes, medical observations, and Huguette's own words. Yet the people closest to the process had interests that opposing lawyers could question. That left the April will itself. Its 7 pages were more detailed than the March plan. The document named property, workers, museums, relatives, and percentages with precision. It did not look like a confused fragment. The dispute was whether that precision represented Huguette's independent wishes. The April 19th will began by revoking earlier wills. It then directed the creation of the Bellosguardo Foundation as an educational organization whose primary purpose would be fostering and promoting the arts. Huguette gave the foundation the Santa Barbara estate at 1407 East Cabrillo Boulevard, along with personal property there, insurance connected to it, and most of the art, musical instruments, rare books, and library material kept in the Fifth Avenue apartments. The provision joined two of her empty homes through their contents. New York would supply objects. California would supply the permanent setting. She made specific gifts to people who had served her. Physician Henry Singman was to receive $100,000. Former assistant Christopher Sattler was to receive $500,000. Bellosguardo's manager was to receive 2 years of salary. The Connecticut caretaker was to receive 1 year of salary. The Fifth Avenue maintainer was to receive $25,000. Attorney Wallace Bach and accountant Irving Kamsler were each named for $500,000. Beth Israel Hospital was to receive $1 million. The doll collection went to Peri. A Claude Monet painting from the Water Lilies series went to the Corcoran Gallery of Art. After those gifts, the residuary estate was divided 60% to Peri or her descendants, 25% to Huguette's goddaughter Wanda Steica or her descendants, and 15% to the Bellosguardo Foundation. Then came the sentence that turned distance into a testamentary fact. Huguette intentionally made no provision for relatives on either side of the family because contact had been minimal over the years. She described the named beneficiaries as the proper recipients of her giving. The clause did legal work. It showed that the omission was not an accident. Whoever prepared the will anticipated that relatives existed and that excluding them required clarity. For supporters of the will, the plan matched Huguette's actual relationships. She had lived apart from extended family for decades. Peri cared for her daily. Steica belonged to an artistic family connected with the Clarks. The Corcoran held her father's collection and had exhibited her work. Bellosguardo represented her strongest surviving link to a family home. Staff had kept the properties ready. For challengers, the same document concentrated benefits among people and charities in the orbit of an isolated 98-year-old woman. Bach drafted a will that gave him money and made him an executor. Kamsler received the same bequest and executor role. Peri received the largest personal share, after already accepting millions. The second will displaced a document signed only 6 weeks earlier. The law could hold both patterns at once. A bequest may fit a life and still result from undue influence. A beneficiary may have access and still receive a valid gift. The facts required a process for testing witnesses, documents, and trust. Huguette lived another 6 years. The will remained in place. Her world narrowed further as age and hearing loss made communication harder. Advisors continued handling property and money. Caregivers continued entering the room. The houses continued accumulating costs and value. In 2010, public reporting broke through the privacy around her. Questions about the fortune, the hospital stay, and the handling of her affairs reached a wide audience. Officials examined whether anyone was exploiting an elderly woman. Lawyers defended Huguette's right to privacy and described her as strong-willed. The focus did not produce a public interview with Huguette. She remained the least accessible person in a story about her own choices. On May 24, 2011, she died at Beth Israel Medical Center, 16 days before her 105th birthday. The hospital door, that had controlled access for 2 decades, could no longer contain the dispute. Her will had to be filed. Her assets had to be counted. Private decisions became public claims. Huguette Clark died without descendants. The nearest people in daily life were not the people estate law called family. The people called family had not shared her daily life. That gap was the space into which more than $300 million would fall. The April will was filed in June 2011. Its initial public account estimated the personal estate near $400 million, though later legal summaries used more than $300 million. Valuation was difficult because the assets included unique property. A Fifth Avenue apartment is worth what a buyer will pay. A Monet's price can change in an evening. Bellosguardo's oceanfront land could be appraised, but its intended use as a foundation complicated the meaning of market value. The filing revealed the foundation plan, the percentages for Peri and Styka, the specific gifts, the family exclusion, and the art bequests. It also revealed potential conflicts that had been hidden from most of the public. The estate had to preserve property while the will's validity remained uncertain. Public Administrator Ethel Griffin took a role in overseeing assets. Inventories and appraisals began. The very rooms Huguette had protected were open to lawyers, auction specialists, photographers, and prospective buyers. Inventory reverses the meaning of a room. While Huguette lived, objects belonged together because she had placed them together. After death, each object needed an account, an owner, an appraised value, and a proposed destination. A painting might be part of the foundation gift, part of a disputed bequest, or an asset available for sale. Furniture that had supported one room for decades became a lot number or a cost of removal. The process also created a new form of access. People who could never have obtained an invitation from Huguette entered under legal power. Their job was not to preserve the emotional order of the home. It was to administer an estate accurately enough to survive challenge. At 907 Fifth Avenue, 42 rooms held layers of personal and family history. There were paintings, furniture, books, instruments, papers, and evidence of a household stopped in 1991. The rooms had been maintained, but they were no longer arranged around a possible return. They were categories in an estate, in a bank vault. Jewel cases contained pieces Huguette had not worn for decades. Christie's later sold 17 jewels for $20. A pink diamond accounted for more than $15 million of that total. The auction transformed objects kept out of view into highly public prices. Art sales did the same. In May 2014, paintings from the estate, including works by Monet and Renoir, brought $40.9 million. A further sale of 357 Clark family objects in June achieved about $8.5 million. 17 paintings by Huguette herself brought $142,625. Those sales were not merely decorative episodes after the legal drama. They converted stored value into the liquid estate needed for taxes, settlements, expenses, and distributions. They also dissolved the physical collection Huguette had spent decades keeping together. The properties faced different paths. The New York units could be sold separately. Connecticut had no foundation purpose in the will. Bellosguardo was specifically designated for art, but it could not transfer cleanly until probate and tax issues were resolved. The death also changed how earlier gifts were viewed. While Huguette lived, a check could be defended as her personal choice. After death, an estate representative could ask whether money should be returned. Medical professionals, the nurse, the hospital, the attorney, and the accountant faced scrutiny over transactions that had occurred behind a door the public never crossed. The will contest brought 19 relatives into opposition. The Corcoran also sought to challenge aspects of the document, even though it had been named for the Monet. Different challengers wanted different outcomes, but all had reason to question the April plan. The executors defended the will. They argued that Huguette was alert, aware of her property, and deliberate about excluding distant family. Her long choice for privacy, in their account, should not be converted into incapacity merely because outsiders found it peculiar. The stage was set for a trial about much more than a signature. It would be a trial about who had been allowed into Huguette's life, what they received, and whether a woman can choose need without surrendering autonomy. The lawsuit lasted more than 2 years and involved 54 depositions in 3 countries. Lawyers reconstructed family trees, property handling, medical care, gifts, phone contact, art, finances, and the drafting of both wills. The relatives' argument drew power from combination. Huguette was extremely old. She had lived in a hospital for years after medical recovery. She rarely met people face to face. Her nurse received about $30 million in lifetime gifts and stood to receive the largest personal share under the final will. Her attorney and accountant helped manage her affairs, were named as executors, and received bequests. The April will reversed a March document favoring family. Each fact alone might be explained. Together, challengers said, they showed a vulnerable woman surrounded by beneficiaries who could control details and access. They alleged lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence. The defense also built a combined picture. Huguette had chosen privacy for decades before Peri, Bach, or Kamsler occupied their later roles. She knew the properties in detail and continued funding them. She had no meaningful relationship with most of the relatives. The Art Foundation, Corcoran gift, staff bequests, and recognition of a trusted caregiver all reflected long-standing interests and chosen loyalties. Witnesses who spoke with her described sharp mind, memory, and firm choices. A person could find her decisions eccentric without showing that she failed the legal test for making a will. The defense warned that treating privacy as incapacity would allow distant kin to override the life she actually lived. The hospital evidence resisted a clean narrative. Records from the 1991 admission showed serious self-neglect before care. Later observations showed recovery and ease. Some professionals encouraged discharge. The hospital continued to accept a paying resident. Huguette continued to refuse a return to Fifth Avenue. The gifts were equally double-edged. Their size could suggest abuse, especially where professional caregivers accepted them. Their pattern could also suggest a woman who used wealth freely and understood that she had more than she needed. The question was not whether the checks existed, It was whether they revealed her agency or another person's control. The empty mansions became character evidence. To challengers, maintaining them while living in a hospital could appear irrational. To defenders, the houses demonstrated memory, wealth, choice, and consistency. Huguette did not forget Bellosguardo. She preserved it for decades and directed it toward an arts foundation. A jury would have had to listen without confusing dislike for legal proof. The April will could be invalid even if some bequests were sensible. It could be valid even if professionals behaved poorly in other transactions. Capacity is measured at the time of signing. Undue influence may exist even when a person can manage other affairs. The standards overlap, but they are not identical. Testamentary capacity is narrower than the ability to manage every detail of a complex fortune. A person may rely heavily on an accountant and still understand that she owns 3 major properties and a valuable collection. She may forget an ordinary appointment and still know the people who would inherit. The relevant question is tied to the act of making the will. Undue influence looks beyond understanding to freedom of decision. A person may comprehend every clause and still sign because another person has overborne her wishes. That is why access, secrecy, need, and abrupt change mattered even if witnesses described Huguette as alert. The case required proof not only of what she knew, but of whose purpose the April split served. The trial promised witnesses whose trust could be tested in public. What did Bach explain before Huguette signed? Who suggested the change split? How did she respond when relatives were discussed? What did medical observers record near the date? Did Peri participate in the plan? How did the March and April drafts develop? Jury choice began in September 2013. At that point, the process was ready to turn years of private evidence into a public decision. It did not happen. The parties negotiated a settlement. That choice reduced the risk that one side would lose everything and the cost of a long trial. It also preserved the central uncertainty. A settlement distributes rights. It does not tell historians which contested facts a jury would have accepted. The September 2013 settlement redirected major parts of the estate. The relatives received $34.5 million. Hadassah Peri gave up her bequest under the April will and agreed to return about $5 million from earlier gifts. She retained much of what Huguette had already given her during life. Wallace Bach and Irving Kamsler did not receive their bequests or the executor pay they had expected. Arts organizations received the largest institutional benefits. Bellosguardo remained designated for a foundation, along with cash and property needed to support its purpose. The Corcoran received a substantial settlement connected with the art dispute. The settlement can look like a compromise verdict if each result is treated as a finding. That would be a mistake. Peri's return does not prove a jury found she coerced Huguette. The relative's payment does not prove the March will was valid. The survival of the Bellosguardo plan does not prove every clause of the April will arose independently. The boundary protects every side from claims the record cannot support. It prevents the settlement from becoming a posthumous diagnosis of Huguette. It also prevents defenders from saying the art's outcome erased legitimate concerns about access and conflicts. The settlement was a practical answer to a legal contest, not a medical report and not a moral certificate. For historians, this limit is useful discipline. A dramatic ending does not become more truthful when uncertainty is removed. The unresolved question explains why the case still attracts focus. The documents are abundant, yet the decisive talk remains inaccessible. Deal amounts reflect legal risk, tax consequences, bargaining, and the desire to end lawsuit. Parties may surrender claims they believe are valid because certainty has value. This procedural fact is the honest answer to the question the story raises. No court determined whether Huguette lacked testamentary capacity on April 19, 2005. No court determined that Peri, Bach, Kamsler, the hospital, or anyone else exercised undue influence over that will. Allegations were made, denied, investigated, and settled. The absence of a verdict does not leave us with nothing. It tells us which evidence created enough risk to bring all sides to agreement. Extreme seclusion mattered. Conflicted advisors mattered. Vast caregiver gifts mattered. 2 wills in 6 weeks mattered. So did a life of deliberate privacy, weak family ties, detailed property knowledge, and long-standing support for art. The compromise also acknowledged more than one meaning of family. Legal relatives received money even though the April will excluded them. A caregiver kept much of the lifetime wealth she had received, but lost the testamentary share. Museums and arts charities tied to Huguette's artistic life received property and funds. No side obtained the whole story it wanted. The settlement allowed the estate to move from argument to distribution. Houses could be sold or transferred. Art could be auctioned. Taxes and claims could be paid. The staff who had maintained waiting rooms could finally receive new instructions from new owners. At 907 Fifth Avenue, the 3 apartments were offered at a combined $55 million and sold separately. Their new owners could renovate spaces Huguette had kept almost unchanged for decades. The sale broke the Manhattan household into market units. Le Beau Chateau sold for $14.3 million in April 2014. For the first time since Huguette bought it in the early 1950s, the main house could become someone's actual home rather than a maintained option. Bellosguardo moved slowly. Probate, oversight, and tax issues delayed transfer. The oceanfront property remained in institutional custody for years after Huguette's death. In 2018, it formally passed to the Bellosguardo Foundation. That transfer fulfilled the most visible idea in the April will without validating every contested part of the document. The house Huguette had not entered for more than 50 years would no longer be kept only for her potential return. Its new purpose required carefully managed public access. The settlement answered who would receive money. The properties answered what happened next. Neither answered why one hospital room had become preferable to all 3 houses. For that, the most responsible conclusion stays close to the evidence. The hospital gave Huguette a scale and boundary she repeatedly chose. The fortune kept other choices open. People near her benefited, cared for her, advised her, or did several of those things at once. The precise balance of free choice and influence was never adjudicated. After the Fifth Avenue apartments were sold, their rooms ceased to form one private archive. Walls could move. The collection left. The building remained, but the Clark arrangement inside it ended. After Le Beau Chateau was sold, the maintained option became a home another family could occupy. Its decades of vacancy had not destroyed it because caretakers had kept intervening. The absence ended in a sale, not a ruin. Bellosguardo followed a different path. The foundation received the property in 2018. It began using the estate for arts events and later offered limited docent-led tours. The process was slower and more contested than the will's optimistic language suggested, but the basic conversion occurred. A house preserved through private payroll became a place the public could enter under controlled conditions. That final phrase matters. Bellosguardo did not become an open park where anyone could wander at any hour. Access remained scheduled and managed. In that sense, the foundation inherited something beyond land and furniture. It inherited Huguette's problem of how to let people in without surrendering the house. The property also preserved the evidence of work. Gardens survived because people tended them. Rooms survived because people cleaned and repaired them. Art survived because someone controlled climate, light, handling, and security. The mansion's stillness was made, day after day, by labor. That labor links the episode to the wider history of great houses. A mansion is usually photographed from the front, as if architecture alone maintains status. In practice, status depends on people arriving early, entering service doors, tracking inventories, and repairing what weather and use damage. At Bellosguardo, the owner could disappear while the service structure remained. The arrangement exposed what occupied mansions often conceal. Huguette's absence, therefore, did not remove human life from the estate. It shifted focus away from the owner and toward the workers who kept her wishes material. Their success made the place appear untouched. The better they did their jobs, the easier it was to imagine that nothing was happening. That is the first part of the title's answer. Huguette Clark did not simply leave 3 mansions empty. She kept them ready. Money paid workers to hold change at a distance. The houses remained possible homes long after she stopped using them. The second part is the hospital room. Huguette entered because she was gravely ill. She stayed after surgery because the room offered an arrangement she preferred enough to renew for almost 20 years. Care, food, security, and company arrived within a boundary she could see. Returning to 42 rooms would have meant rebuilding a household around an aging woman who resisted new access. This answer does not require calling the choice normal. It requires recognizing it as a choice supported by extraordinary means. Most patients cannot rent a hospital room for decades. Most homeowners cannot keep 3 large properties staffed without using them. Wealth allowed Huguette to choose a small, occupied world, while refusing to release the large, empty ones. The third part is the estate fight. The same arrangement that protected her autonomy made her vulnerable to doubt. By limiting contact, she ensured that only a few people could observe her decisions. By giving those people money, she made their testimony easier to challenge. By refusing conventional family life, she left distant relatives with legal status but little knowledge of her. Her privacy did not prove incapacity. Her giving did not prove freedom from pressure. The empty houses did not prove she had forgotten them. The hospital stay did not prove she was held there. Each fact could support more than one argument, because Huguette's life joined autonomy and dependence in unusual proportions. William Clark had used wealth to force his way into public rooms. He pursued a Senate seat, built a Fifth Avenue palace, and filled galleries with art. His youngest daughter inherited the money and reversed its direction. She used it to decide who could enter, which rooms would remain unchanged, and how far away she could live from the properties carrying her name. Yet even her control had limits. After death, the doors opened to appraisers, lawyers, buyers, and visitors. The objects were counted, the gifts were totaled, the wills were compared line by line. People she had excluded from daily life received part of the estate. People she had favored lost promised bequests. A foundation inherited the house she wanted preserved. The 2013 settlement prevented a jury from declaring one side's account the legal truth. That is not an unsatisfying gap to cover with certainty. It is the final fact. We can document the choice to stay, the money spent on homes, the gifts to caregivers, the two contradictory wills, and the terms of the settlement. We cannot honestly claim to know the exact pressure inside every conversation, or the private reason Huguette rejected every return home. What survives is more concrete than a diagnosis. At Bellosguardo, sunlight still reaches rooms maintained through decades of absence. The house did not wait because time stopped. It waited because people worked, and Huguette paid them. At 907 Fifth Avenue, new owners live where her collection once stood. In Connecticut, another family finally used the house she never entered. At Bellosguardo, visitors now cross a threshold she kept closed for most of her life. The fortune built to make William Clark visible ended by preserving Huguette Clark's absence. Then that preservation became her most public legacy. 3 mansions were kept ready. 1 hospital room was chosen, and the court case that might have explained the choice ended by dividing the money without deciding who, in the final years, truly controlled the door.